The rain didn't start as a drop. It started as a wall. I stood knee-deep in a trench of my own making, the heavy coastal mud gripping my boots like wet cement. The ozone smell of the storm had been hanging over Foggy Morning Park since dawn, but I had ignored it, too focused on correcting the drainage slope of my side yard to care. Cold water hit my shoulders, instantly soaking through my gray cotton t-shirt and matting it to my bare skin. Driving the flat edge of my spade into the earth, I severed a thick root, the sound a dull, wet snap in the downpour. "You know," a voice called out over the drumming rhythm of the storm, "most people go inside when the sky falls." Scraping the thick clay from the blade of my shovel, I turned. Elaina Harris stood on the covered perimeter of her wraparound porch, a heavy cream-colored towel bundled in her hands. She wore a pale canvas work shirt and faded jeans, completely dry under the cedar-shingled roof. I had lived next door to her for 6 months. In that time, we had exchanged polite nods, a few comments about the invasive ivy on the fence line, and little else. Spending 9 months of the year in the dirt of foreign excavation sites meant I wasn't exactly practiced at being a neighbor. My mail piled up, my grass grew too long, and I kept my head down. Stepping out of the trench, my boots made a terrible sucking sound against the earth. I walked the 20 yards to her property line, letting the driving rain wash the worst of the grit from my arms, and stepped under the overhang of her porch. The sudden absence of the rain left a ringing silence in my ears, broken only by the steady drum of water hitting the wooden steps behind me. She held out the towel. I took it, the terry cloth thick and dry against my palms. "You're more soaked than I was expecting," Elaina noted, a faint, tired smile touching the corners of her mouth. Her eyes were sharp, taking in the mud smeared across my jaw and the rigid, braced set of my shoulders against the cold. "I prefer the term hydrologically saturated," I replied, rubbing the towel aggressively over my hair. Dropping the fabric from my head, I draped it around my neck, pulling the ends tight. "Thanks." I lost track of the front moving in. Usually, my crew chief yells at me before I drown. "I was watching from the kitchen window," she murmured, her volume dropping a fraction of an inch to cut under the wind. "You dig like you're looking for something, Caleb, not like you're just fixing a pipe. You measure every scoop of dirt before you throw it over your shoulder." That observation caught me off guard. Most people just saw a guy with a shovel making a mess of a lawn. Occupational habit. I'm a field archaeologist. When I see dirt, my first instinct is to read the stratigraphy before I move it. Elaina didn't laugh. She didn't offer a polite, empty inquiry about old bones or buried gold. She looked past me, out toward the heavy curtain of rain beating down on the patch of earth between our houses. Beyond her porch sat a beautiful, dilapidated Victorian greenhouse, its antique glass panes rattling violently in the wind. The iron framework was rusted at the joints, but the structure itself was a masterpiece of 19th century engineering, anchored deep into the soil. "If you know how to read the dirt," she said, her tone shifting from neighborly to something brittle and strained. "I have a problem." Wiping the mud from my hands using a dry corner of the towel, I followed her gaze. "I mostly deal with things that have been dead for 1,000 years. This is only 130 years old," she countered. Turning, she gestured to a small patio table pushed against the siding of her house. It was covered in a thick, clear plastic tarp, but underneath, stacks of manila folders, oversized architectural blueprints, and what looked like centuries-old correspondence were visible. "And it's about to be demolished by a developer named Derek Cooper." Everyone in the coastal district knew Derek Cooper. He was the man buying up the historic lots on the ridge, tearing down the rot, and putting up identical, soulless, modern builds that maximized square footage and minimized character. He moved through the local zoning board like a bulldozer. "He bought the acreage behind me last month," Elaina explained, crossing her arms as a gust of cold wind swept over the porch. "They claim the historical property line is 50 feet further south than the current fence. If they enforce the new digital boundary, it cuts right through the center of my greenhouse." I walked over to the table and tapped the heavy plastic tarp. Property lines in this county were mapped in the 1880s using stone markers. If your deed says the line is the fence, he can't just move it. Hire a local surveyor to contest his map. It's a standard civil dispute. "A new surveyor won't help me," she replied, her jaw tightening as she looked at the rattling glass of her greenhouse. "Cooper already has the town council leaning his way for the commercial tax revenue. Every digital map in the county system defaults to his new GPS coordinates because the town updated their software last year. The only thing that legally supersedes the digital overlay is the physical 1,890 boundary stone. So, point to the stone. It's missing, Elaina said, pointing to a specific dip in the topography of her backyard, right where the grass met a thick line of old-growth blackberry bushes. My grandfather wrote that it was buried in the mudslide of 42. The earth just swallowed it. Derek's surveyor claims it doesn't exist. Without the physical marker, I have no legal ground to stand on. The town will approve the demolition. Looking out at the rain, I calculated the soil composition. The ground here was a mix of dense clay and topsoil. A granite stone buried in the 40s wouldn't have moved far, but it would be entirely invisible to a standard surveyor's equipment. It required a methodical, destructive search. It required an excavation. I wasn't doing this as a favor. The university board grounded me for a semester over a bureaucratic permit dispute in Peru, claiming my field timeline was out of compliance. I had been sitting in this house for 6 weeks, losing my mind, waiting for an appeal. A clean, well-documented preservation recovery on home soil was the first piece of undeniable fieldwork they couldn't simply dismiss. She spread the original deed across the patio table. The thick paper yellowed at the edges. I stopped feeling like a man hiding from a suspension and started feeling like I was back on a site that mattered. We establish a baseline when the rain stops, I instructed, my voice cutting cleanly through the sound of the storm. Before we could break ground, we hit a wall with the town's records. The online portal only went back to 1,985. We needed the physical 1,904 tax map to cross-reference the original surveyor's notes. Without it, my grid would be flying blind. We drove my Jeep down to the municipal building, a squat brick structure that smelled permanently of floor wax, stale coffee, and old paper. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile, flickering glare over the linoleum floors. Jane Flores, the town clerk, stood behind the high laminate counter. She had known Elaina for years and looked at us with a mixture of pity and exhaustion when we walked through the double doors. "Elaina, honey," Jane sighed. Leaning heavily on the counter, a stack of stamping pads pushed to the side. "Cooper's lawyers were just here an hour ago, pulling the preliminary demolition permits. You're draining your savings, fighting a digital line. The council has already made up its mind. They want the new subdivision." Jane wouldn't meet her eyes. She focused on aligning a stack of blank zoning forms on her desk, avoiding the confrontation. Elena's fingers dug so hard into the laminate counter, her knuckles turned bone white. The silence in the room stretched, thick with the unspoken reality that the town was perfectly willing to let her be steamrolled for the sake of higher property taxes. Before Elaina could defend herself to a woman who had already written the greenhouse off as firewood, I stepped forward and slid my state archaeological credential across the counter, letting the heavy plastic ID hit the wood with a sharp clack. "Ma'am, we aren't contesting a GPS line," I stated, keeping my voice level and perfectly polite. I didn't raise my volume. I just let the authority of the badge do the heavy lifting. I am conducting a formal heritage survey. Under state statute, I need access to the original hard copy plat maps for the Harris estate. If the town has misplaced them, I'll need to note that in my compliance report to the State Preservation Office. Jane looked at the badge, then at my mud-stained boots, and finally at Elaina. The dismissive pity faltered, replaced by a flicker of bureaucratic caution. "I'll get the keys to the basement archive," she muttered. "You have 1 hour," Jane said, unlocking the heavy cage door labeled Pre-1950 Land Records before retreating quickly up the concrete stairs. As the heavy door clicked shut above us, Elaina let out a long, shaky breath and leaned back against the metal shelving. I switched on a heavy-duty flashlight, clicking the beam over the dusty racks, deliberately shifting the atmosphere from public authority to practical teamwork. "Divide and conquer," I said, handing her a pair of white cotton archive gloves from my jacket pocket. "You take the ledgers from 1890 to 1900. I'll take the next decade." The air was thick with gray dust. She didn't hesitate, pulling the 20-pound leather-bound ledgers down with immense competence, her eyes tracking columns of cursive script. Barely 20 minutes in, her voice echoed in the concrete room. "Got it." I walked over. She had a ledger spread open on a metal reading table. Her finger rested on a hand-drawn map of the county. There, in faded black ink, was the outline of the Harris estate. "Look at the surveyor's notation," she said, pointing to a block of text at the bottom. Leaning over the table, I studied the parchment. My eyes caught a tiny marginal note near the compass rose at the top right corner. Marker placed 200 yards due north of the municipal well. Granite, 2 feet. Where is the old well? I asked, pulling out my phone to snap a high-resolution photo of the page. Paved over in the 60s, she said, frustration bleeding into her words. It's under the asphalt of the elementary school parking lot down the hill. We can't dig up a school. That's fine, I said, putting my phone away. We don't need the well. We have the historical distance and the angle. We just need to establish the relative grid on your property. 20 minutes later, we were back in my Jeep, the engine idling as the heater blasted the damp chill from the cab. I had a heavy cardboard tube containing a certified copy of the 1904 map resting on the dashboard. Elaina reached into her canvas satchel and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. The cover was cracked, the pages yellowed and uneven. She held it out to me. My grandfather's field journal, she said, her voice quiet but entirely steady. It has his hand-drawn sketches of the property line before the mudslide hit. It's the only copy in existence. I looked at the fragile leather. In my line of work, handing over primary source documentation was the ultimate transfer of trust. She was putting the only proof of her family's history directly into my hands. I took the book, holding it carefully by the spine. I won't let it get wet, and I won't let Cooper touch it. A fraction of the tension left her shoulders. She gave a single, firm nod. I know. With the coordinates secured, we returned to the property. The rain had slowed to a miserable drizzle. For the next hour, I pulled my gear from the Pelican case. Setting up a total station in deep mud is an exercise in frustration. The tripod legs kept sinking, throwing the laser off level. I cursed under my breath, my boots slipping as I tried to stabilize the aluminum legs. Before I could readjust, Elaina stepped into the mud beside me. She didn't ask what to do. She picked up a wooden stake and a heavy rubber mallet from my open case. Where do you need the anchor? She asked. 2 feet to your left? I grunted, holding the tripod steady. She drove the stake into the ground with 3 clean, powerful strikes of the mallet. I placed the tripod foot against the solid wood. The bubble on the level finally centered. I looked at her, rain dripping from the brim of my cap. Nice swing, I noted. I built half the raised beds in that greenhouse, she replied, wiping a smudge of dirt from her cheek. I know how to swing a hammer. Caleb? By 9 o'clock, the grid was secure. Neon pink masonry string hovered in perfect 5x5 meter squares over the disaster zone of her backyard. I knelt at the corner of Unit Alpha, using a flat-edged shovel to skim the top layer of modern grass away, when a heavy, late-model truck pulled into the dirt access road behind Elena's property. The engine cut out. Derek Cooper stepped into the wet grass, wearing a tailored jacket that had no business being on a job site, carrying a rolled-up set of architectural plans. Elena's hands balled into fists at her sides. Setting my shovel down, I wiped my hands on my canvas pants and stood up, placing myself squarely between the excavation grid and the property line. Elaina, Cooper called out, carrying an unearned familiarity. I see you're still fighting the inevitable and making a mess of the landscaping. He cast a disdainful look at my stakes and string. She has 30 days before the injunction takes effect. Cooper, I stated, maintaining a flat, undeniable volume. Cooper assessed my muddy boots, clearly categorizing me as a hired laborer. And who are you? The gardener? Caleb White, lead field director, Department of Archaeology. I held up my badge again. I am conducting a localized survey for a historical artifact. If your machines cross that fence line while my grid is active, you'll trigger a mandatory state preservation audit. It'll freeze your commercial permits for 6 months while the Capitol investigates a civil code violation. Cooper's eyes narrowed. He looked at the laser total station, recognizing a piece of equipment worth more than his truck, and realized the Gardner narrative was dead. The property line is contested, Cooper shot back, his tone losing its smugness. That ground belongs to my LLC. The deed belongs to Miss Harris until a judge says otherwise, I countered. Pulling a waterproof field notebook from my chest pocket, I clicked my pen. I'm documenting your presence on the active site at 0914 hours. Are you officially demanding I halt a heritage survey, Mr. Cooper? I need it for the record. Silence stretched between us, filled only by the distant sound of highway traffic. I simply held the pen, waiting for his answer. You're wasting your time, Cooper sneered, turning back toward his truck. The hearing is in 3 weeks. Rocks won't stop a zoning board? Tires spun angrily in the mud as he drove off. Putting my notebook away, I turned back to the grid. Elaina was staring at me, her expression a mix of shock and relief. "You didn't have to put your credentials on the line for me," she murmured. "I didn't," I replied, picking up my shovel. I just framed the procedural truth in a way he couldn't afford to ignore. "Now, unless you want him to win, grab that bucket. We have a lot of dirt to move." Over the next 4 days, a functional, quiet rhythm took hold. Every morning at 6 a.m., the back porch light flicked on, signaling 2 mugs of black coffee waiting on the patio table. We sat in the cool dawn air as the fog rolled off the coastal ridge. On Wednesday morning, the weather finally broke, leaving the air crisp and cold. I walked onto the porch, carrying my canvas tool roll. Elaina was already there, wrapped in a thick gray sweater, poring over her grandfather's journal. I sat down across from her, unrolled my canvas, and began using a whetstone to sharpen the edge of my Marshalltown trowel. The rhythmic scraping sound of stone on steel filled the silence. "He talks a lot about the soil composition here," Elaina said without looking up, her finger tracing a line of faded cursive. "He said the clay was so dense it broke 3 shovels when he laid the foundation for the greenhouse." "He wasn't wrong," I said, testing the edge of my trowel with my thumb. "It's glacial till. It holds water like a sponge, which is why the mudslide didn't wash away, it just settled and hardened." She looked up, her eyes catching the early morning light. Her hands were stained with a faint trace of black ink from handling the old pages. I watched the way her fingers gripped the edge of the book. I wanted to reach across the table, to take the book from her and tell her to rest, to let me carry the weight of it. Instead, I picked up a screwdriver, walked over to the porch door, and silently tightened a loose hinge that had been squeaking for 3 days. I fixed the physical environment to make her space quieter, locking down the impulse to cross the line. By late Thursday afternoon, the physical toll of the dig was setting in. My shoulders ached. Knuckles scraped raw from sifting through the rocky clay. I knelt in the trench, using a small hand trowel to carefully scrape away the B-horizon soil, looking for the specific color change that indicates a historical cut in the earth. "I'm not finding the intrusion," I reported, tossing a handful of sterile clay into the bucket. "The stratigraphy is unbroken. The mudslide layered over this area, but nobody dug a hole here to place a stone." Elaina sat on the edge of the trench, a clipboard resting on her knees. "Are we in the wrong spot?" "It's possible." Wiping sweat from my forehead, I left a streak of dirt across my brow. Or maybe the stone was a myth. People lie in their diaries all the time. The words slipped out before I could catch them, my blunt reflex striking exactly when it shouldn't. Elaina closed the clipboard with a sharp snap. "My grandfather didn't lie," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "He built that greenhouse with his own hands. He wouldn't invent a boundary marker just to sound important." Standing up, she turned toward the house. I dropped the trowel. Climbing out of the trench, my boot slipped slightly on the edge. I stepped into her line of sight, forcing her to pause without crowding her space. "I apologize," I said, stripping the sarcasm completely from my tone. "That was careless. I'm looking at data, and I forgot I'm looking at your family." Instead of offering a hollow platitude, I walked over to my pelican case, pulled out the Munsell soil chart, and returned to her side. "Look at this," I instructed, pointing to the book of color swatches, then to the side wall of the trench. "You see that dark band of soil, about 2 feet down? That's organic matter. That's the original topsoil from 1890, before the mudslide covered it. The earth remembers everything. If the stone is here, the soil will show me where the hole was dug. I just need to find the scar." Elaina exhaled a long, shaky breath. The rigid line of her shoulders softened. "Okay," she whispered. That evening, the air cooled rapidly. I sat at the patio table, typing coordinates into my laptop. Looking up, I saw Elaina rubbing her temples, eyes squeezed shut, a subtle tremor in her fingers as she tried to massage away a headache born of staring at 19th century cursive. Standing up, I went into her kitchen and filled the electric kettle. The kitchen was warm, smelling of dried herbs and old wood. Finding a box of chamomile tea in the pantry, I brewed a cup, letting it steep exactly 3 minutes. Walking back out onto the porch, I placed the warm ceramic mug squarely over the archival document she was studying. Startled, she opened her eyes, looking from the mug to me. "Drink. You're hit with screen fatigue, and your eyes aren't tracking right." She wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic, the tremor in her fingers slowly stilling. "I have to finish cross-referencing the 1904 tax map. The map will be there tomorrow, I countered, sitting back down at my laptop. You are the project manager. If the project manager collapses, the excavation halts. It's bad logistics. A genuine smile broke across her face, illuminating the exhaustion with something resilient. You have a very strange bedside manner, Caleb. I work with rocks, I noted, keeping my eyes on the screen. My hand stayed firmly on the keyboard, locking down the sudden instinct to reach across the table and smooth the worry line between her eyebrows. Action over impulse. Drink the tea. On Friday afternoon, the screen door slammed open so hard the hinges whined. I was at the bottom of the trench, brushing dirt away from a piece of rusted iron. Elaina walked to the edge of the excavation unit, clutching a thick, cream-colored envelope bearing a certified mail sticker. The heavy paper of the legal notice slipped against her canvas jacket with a dry crackle. Cooper expedited the injunction, she announced. Stopping my brush, I leaned my forearms against the edge of the trench. Show me. She handed the document down. Cooper's lawyers had petitioned a judge for an emergency variance, claiming the ruinous state of the greenhouse was an immediate public safety hazard. A preliminary order had been granted. We have 48 hours, Elaina stated, her voice devoid of inflection. In 48 hours, the town executes the digital property line. His bulldozers will be here on Monday morning. The hearing next week doesn't matter anymore. The math clicked into place in my head. We had excavated 3 separate units, finding nothing but roots and clay. We don't have enough time to open a new 5x5 unit. It takes 3 days to properly clear and map a section that size without destroying the context. Wrapping her arms around herself, she shivered despite the humidity. She stared blankly into the bottom of the trench. Folding the legal notice, I shoved it into my back pocket. I refused to let the momentum die. It's not over, I said, dropping into the steady cadence I used when a dig was collapsing and the crew was panicking. Climbing out of the trench, I grabbed the archival map she had been studying and spread it out on the hood of my Pelican case. Come here. She stepped closer, the faint scent of vanilla and old paper cutting through the smell of wet earth. Look at the compass rose on this 1,892 map, I instructed, pointing a dirty finger at the marginal note I had spotted days ago in the archive. What does it say? Elaina squinted. It says, magnetic north. Exactly. Magnetic north drifts over time due to the shifting of the Earth's molten core. I noticed the old fence line didn't perfectly align with the modern GPS grid. If Cooper's surveyor used digital true north to map an 1,892 deed that relied on a magnetic compass reading, the angle is completely wrong. Pulling a thick, spiral-bound field manual from my case, I opened to the archived NOAA declination tables. I grabbed a piece of graphing paper and a pencil, quickly sketching the geometry. The magnetic declination for this coastline has shifted approximately 10 degrees east since 1890. We aren't in the wrong spot because the stone is gone. We're in the wrong spot because we're looking where north is now, not where north was then. I didn't rely on just my math. I pulled my phone out and dialed Andrew Brown, the county's oldest retired surveyor. When I explained the discrepancy, he was silent for a long moment over the speakerphone. You're telling me, Andrew's gravelly voice crackled through the small speaker, that a state archaeologist thinks my county lines are skewed by a century of lodestone drift? I'm telling you the math proves it, Andrew. Check the 1,892 variants. I heard the sound of papers shuffling on his end. Then, a low whistle. Cooper's boys rely on satellites. Satellites don't know anything about 19th century compass fluid. Give me an hour, Caleb. I'll run the formal conversion and stamp it. Ending the call, I grabbed a tape measure and my sighting compass, locking eyes with Elaina. We calculate the drift, pull a single line 10 degrees east, and sink a test pit exactly where the math says the stone should be. Are you with me? She didn't say a word. She just reached past me and snatched the heavy steel spade from the porch steps before I'd even finished folding the map. We worked through the night. I rigged 2 heavy halogen floodlights to the porch railing, casting harsh, artificial daylight over the grass. The shadows in the yard stretched long and sharp. A coastal squall blew in around midnight, bringing a freezing, driving rain that turned the ground into a slick hazard. I told Elaina to go inside, to let me handle the brute force. She refused. Soaked and covered in gray mud, I swung a pickaxe into the unbroken ground 10 feet east of our original grid, breaking the hardpan. Elaina was right behind me, matching my rhythm, shoving her spade into the loosened earth and clearing it from the hole. My grip on the pickaxe handle slipped twice in the wet cold, but I kept swinging, fueled by the ticking clock of Monday morning. At 3 a.m., the pickaxe struck something. It wasn't a dull thud. It was a sharp, ringing crack. The undeniable, bone-rattling sound of steel hitting solid stone. Stopping mid-swing, I let the rain pour down my face, breathing heavily. Elaina dropped her shovel. She fell to her knees in the mud, hands clawing frantically at the loose dirt and pooling water. "Wait!" I ordered, dropping the pickaxe and kneeling beside her. "Let me." Pulling a margin trowel from my belt, I scraped carefully at the mud. My hands steady despite the exhaustion burning in my muscles. Clearing a space 6 inches wide, the dark gray clay gave way to white, speckled granite. I used a soft brush to sweep the remaining water away, exposing the flat face of the rock. The carved H sat there under the floodlights, clean and undeniable, exactly where the recalculated line said it would be. Elaina let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh, her trembling fingers tracing the groove of the carving. My shoulders dropped for the first time in 48 hours, and the freezing rain suddenly felt lighter against my skin. Standing up, my knees cracked in protest. I reached a hand down to her. She gripped my forearm, fingers tight and strong, and I hauled her to her feet. For a second, she stood close, adrenaline and profound relief radiating off her in the cold air. Keeping my hands at my sides, I let the victory be entirely hers. "Go take a hot shower," I instructed, my voice gruff with fatigue. "I'm going to document the coordinates and take the contextual photographs. Tomorrow, we ruin Derek Cooper's day." The next morning, the sun baked the mud solid. Before going into town, I completed the formal state paperwork, logging the exact GPS coordinates of the newly discovered artifact. I drove my battered Jeep into the center of Foggy Morning Park, heading into the local hardware store to buy high-visibility marking paint for the stone. Walking down the plumbing aisle, voices drifted over the shelving, echoing off the concrete floor. "She's out of time," Derek Cooper's confident voice rang out. "The injunction clears on Monday. I want the bulldozers on the property line at 7 a.m. Don't engage with her. Just tear it down." My jaw tightened. Walking calmly to the end of the aisle, I turned and stepped directly into Cooper's path. "You're in my way," Cooper muttered, stopping short. "I filed an SHPO discovery form at the county clerk's office 20 minutes ago," I stated, my voice carrying clearly through the quiet store. I pulled the notarized copy of the form from my jacket pocket, showing the raised state seal. "We located the 1890 boundary obelisk at 0300 hours this morning. Your GPS overlay is invalid due to uncalculated magnetic drift. The historical line stands." Cooper's face went slack, the color draining from his cheeks. "You're lying. You dug up a random rock." "It's a verified historical artifact," I said, folding the paper away. Andrew Brown stamped the topographic conversion himself. "If your bulldozers cross that fence line on Monday, you trigger a mandatory state review and a civil suit for property destruction. Call your dogs off, Cooper. You lost." I didn't wait for his response. Walking past him, I paid for my paint and left. I protected her reputation in a room where she couldn't hear me, neutralizing his leverage with absolute bureaucratic lockdown. Beat 10 arrived on a Tuesday. The emergency variance had forced the board to hear both sides at once, which was the only reason the paperwork still mattered before the demolition crew arrived. The town zoning hearing packed the community center hall with neighbors, local contractors, and curious onlookers. The fluorescent lights buzzed loudly. Elaina and I sat at the front table. She wore a sharp, tailored blazer. I wore a clean button-down shirt, feeling infinitely more comfortable in canvas and mud, but I sat perfectly still, projecting absolute professional calm. Andrew Brown sat in the front row, holding a stamped copy of my topographic report. When called to speak, Elaina didn't just defend her property, she owned the room. She laid out the historical documents, the letters, and finally, the high-resolution photographs of the granite marker in situ. Cooper's lawyer stood up, attempting to object on the grounds of an unverified dig, but Elaina didn't flinch. She turned to Andrew Brown. The old surveyor stood up and officially submitted the certified report, verifying the magnetic declination math, stamping out the lawyer's objection with cold, hard geometry. "The boundary is not missing," Elaina told the board, her voice steady and echoing in the quiet room. "It has been there for 130 years, and thanks to the expertise of my lead field director, it has been recovered safely." She gestured to me, and I gave a single, tight nod to the board. The ruling was swift. The board formally upheld the 1,890 boundary line and permanently dismissed the injunction against the greenhouse. Cooper's lawyer packed his briefcase and left without a word. At the recording desk, Jane Flores picked up her heavy red ink stamper. She brought it down hard, systematically stamping invalid across Cooper's digital overlay. Her posture was noticeably straighter than it had been a week ago. Outside the community center, the afternoon sun was warm. Elaina and I stood on the sidewalk near my Jeep. My phone vibrated in my pocket. Pulling it out, I saw a new email from the university board. Brown had forwarded my SHPO report directly to the Capitol. The subject line sat on my screen like a door cracking open after months of being bolted shut. The board had officially reopened my clearance review. "It's done," Elaina breathed, looking back at the building. The weight of the last 6 months vanished from her posture, leaving her looking taller, brighter. "I don't know how to repay you, Caleb. An invoice doesn't seem to cover it. I don't want an invoice. I did the job." I slid the phone back into my pocket without opening the email further. Elaina reached into her purse, pulling out a heavy brass key on a simple ring. "The lock on the greenhouse is tricky," she explained, her eyes locking onto mine with absolute clarity. She was making a choice, public and concrete, right on the sidewalk where anyone walking out of the hearing could see. "You have to pull the door toward you before you turn it. I know you prefer to read your reports outside, but the wind gets bad on the porch. I cleared out a space and set up a desk for you inside." Among the ferns, the brass key sat heavy in my palm. By the time we reached the curb, I was already deciding which equipment case would go into the greenhouse first. Taking the key, my fingers brushed hers, and this time, I didn't pull away. I felt the steady warmth of her hand against the cool brass. "I'll figure the lock out," I murmured. "And if I accidentally kill one of your ferns, I know how to bury the evidence." She laughed, a bright, unburdened sound that cut through the noise of the street. "You're good with old things, Caleb." "I'm good with things that are built to last," I corrected. Slipping the key into my pocket, we walked back toward our houses. The boundaries between our isolated routines were already beginning to merge. The end. Closing thoughts. A week earlier, freezing rain had pounded that yard like it wanted to erase the very line between our houses. Now, the heavy brass greenhouse key sat warm in my pocket, anchoring me to a physical place. I watched Elaina unlock her front door, and as she left it open for me to follow, I knew exactly which side of the fence I would be crossing at dawn. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.